Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester Jai Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with us I have Prateek Dasgupta, and he's one of my favorite writers here on Substack. He's a great historian, and he writes the Forgotten Footprints blog. Prateek, I really appreciate you coming on, buddy. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the kind of writing that you do?
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to hear that I'm one of your favorite writers. Uh, a bit about me. I started Forgotten Footprints about 3 years back, but I wasn't regular till, let's say, 2024 mid. So my background is actually not in history. I did most of my studies in engineering and sciences and had a career in manufacturing before I took my part-time hobby of writing to a more full-fledged one. I started that just during the pandemic, and as you said, history has always been my passion. Since childhood, it was a combination of, let's say, pop culture, books, exposure to movies, trips to museums, which got me interested in history. And as time went on, I found myself drawn in more towards the lesser known aspects of history which are not covered in popular discourse, and which is why I came up with this newsletter, Forgotten Footprints, where the key focus is to cover the lives of people, sometimes animals, events, civilizations, which are not discussed in mainstream historical discourse.
Well, that's part of what I really enjoy about your work, since, as you probably know, if you're in the sphere of people who, like to read about history, you can have, endless, writing about Alexander the Great, the Romans, the ancient Persians, endless writing about World War II or World War One. But I really enjoy, like you said, you will take a look at things that are lesser known, or like a different look at something that's maybe a little bit more known. Like one of the more recent pieces that you did that I really enjoyed was it the Otzi man or Otzi man? I don't know how you pronounce that. It was like a
Yeah,
Scandinavian
Iceman
man.
Nazi.
Yeah,
Iceman
that,
Nazi.
mhm. Yeah, that was a really fascinating look at history, both like the historical events, but also through the context of food, because you were talking about the Otzi man's last meal. So
Oh,
and I
okay. I think you're talking about the Tolan man. Otzi,
yeah,
I did
Tallinn
a,
man, that was it.
yeah, Tolan man. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. If you want to tell the audience a little bit about that, and I do want to say, by the way, if you're not subscribed to Prateek, go ahead and do that, because if you're a fan of history, like I think a lot of my subscribers are, he's, like I said, one of the more interesting people who writes on here. That having said, do you want to briefly go over that? Because I think that's a really interesting story, and it's a good framing device for some of the other things I want to discuss with you.
Yeah. So, as you pointed out, most of history is focused on the lives of kings, queens, people in the court, because after all, they wrote down the history. But what about the history of people that were there in the past, but we don't know? What I observed is a lot of scientists, archaeologists, and people who are not directly connected with the historical field have an interest in the past. I mean, one of these was the Tolan man. He was found in a peat bog in Denmark in the 1950s. And immediately forensics scientists said that, look, this looks like a case for archaeologists to solve. And as they started looking closely at him, they realized that this was a body belonging to Iron Age Denmark, which is he was roughly maybe around 405 to 380 BC. So that was the period he belonged to. Yet, if you look at the body, it looks like maybe it died a few weeks ago. It was remarkably well preserved in the bog. The bog's acidity had a preserving effect. And after that, scientists, as recently, it was found in 1950, but it was as recent as 2021 that people took a look at what he ate. And there was a surprising amount of farm waste that was fed to him. Um, that sort of tells us about the society back then. We are tempted to go in two directions. One is that Denmark was facing a famine back then, hence, he was just fed the worst food. And the other possibility, of course, is he was a sacrificial victim, and it was a part of a ritual sacrifice, which is what most of the archaeological and historical consensus is. And humiliating the victims was a part of the ritual sacrifice, because there was this feeling that the spirits will come back to haunt them. So when you study this Tollan man and the other bog bodies that were found in Europe, it gives us a remarkable picture of the society that existed in Northern Europe back then, which you won't find in Roman records. And the society was dominated by the Celts, who certainly didn't leave behind a lot of written records. So, how do you construct the history of people who don't leave behind written records, or who give us like a very few clues? And that is something that has always fascinated me.
Yeah, I would agree. It's one of my early passions. I guess when I wasn't a child, and just because I think most people, I don't know about you, when you're into history, when you're a child, you tend to stick to the hits, so to speak. The Greeks, the Romans, et cetera, et cetera. But as I got a little bit older, the idea of pre-Christian Europe was something that was so fascinating to me. Just
Yeah.
because, as you said, the history is written by the victors, so to speak, and there's not really a lot that's known about the pre-Christian or the pre-Roman Europeans specifically, because overwhelmingly they didn't have a written language or anything like that. And that's what I found really fascinating about articles and writing like yours, that has to kind of piece together a story through even something like stomach content. Since, as you probably know, but for the audience, a lot of the history of like the pagan, pre-Christian, Roman era Europeans is something that's kind of pieced together through like largely Roman records, and obviously they're not being I guess you could say, the most sensitive to their culture, and you have to take everything they say about these cultures and these peoples with a grain of salt, because this is something that they're writing and sending back home to the Roman populace.
Absolutely. And there was also the part about propaganda. Like, for example, if we take Julius Caesar's campaign against the Gauls, he proudly says that he killed 1 million Gauls, and most modern historians don't believe that was the case. So, history back then was also a part of propaganda. And sometimes, like, if you see a few other cultures, like if we shift our attention a bit towards the east to the Mongols, they actually also employed something similar but indirectly. So they would import paper and get their opponents to exaggerate their atrocities, which would sort of make them look like these demonic figures who could just vanquish opponents in no time. And that would be spread across the land, which would result in cities surrendering. So it was a part of a tactic, like a tactic to conquer people or to subdue people, where you don't sustain losses to your army.
Yeah, I mean, another example that strikes me was like the ancient Persians, who had like the way that they wrote their history was very, like we could say, propagandistic. Like, oh, we King Xerxes came down and he destroyed the his evil enemies, the Babylonians, and it's great propaganda, but
Yeah.
it's not really history, and it makes it kind of difficult to read and discern. So you have to use these secondary sources.
So here's the thing, history, there is always a storytelling element that is important for historians, because these days, one of the reasons why I notice that many people are fed up with mainstream academic history and you see more of these historical podcasts, YouTube videos, popular writings, like people take an interest in those, is because academics have again focused just too much on the details and what couldn't have happened and why this is wrong, but rather like they have lost a sense of balance. That this is not against academics because I consume their research and most of my work is based on their research. But it is just to give people an idea why sometimes people lose interest in history. As you said, that there's a lot of things written in the records, and much of modern academia's work sometimes goes on like, okay, these records were there, but surely they couldn't have happened. So the truth lies somewhere in between. Some of the things were exaggerated and some of the things were obviously true, and that fine balance and putting it into a nice narrative is something I found that in many modern historical accounts it is missing.
Yeah. Um, and that's kind of what I really enjoy about your work and some other. And I know this is sometimes used as from academics as a slur, but popular historians, somebody like Tom Holland, or somebody like that who is able
Yeah.
to write in a way that is popular and accessible while still having academic rigor. Because I think you're right. Like I'm somebody who like really loves reading about history. Like I'll pretty much anytime I'm at like a used bookstore, I'll just randomly grab a book like, oh, this is, I just happen to see a used book on the Silk Road, or like Ming Dynasty China, whatever it is, and I'll just read it. So my knowledge of history is very eclectic because of that. And it's usually like the ones that because they're not all great. I'll be honest, when you're buying in a kind of random way like that, sometimes it can be a little bit too dry and academic. But the other side of that being, somebody like, say, Graham Hancock, who is, shall we say, very fast and loose or dishonest when he's looking at the historical record, and has, I guess you could say, an unnecessarily adversarial relationship with the academic world.
Absolutely. What Graham Hancock has done is he has tried to fill, so he has tried to capitalize on two things. One is people are curious about the past, but they are not liking how it is presented. So Graham Hancock has tried to uh, raise our awareness about these fantastic megaliths, sites like Karahan Tepe, Gigantica, Gobekli Tepe. They exist all across the world. And then he has gone completely opposite of academia, coming up with a story of a great ice age civilization that existed and people building them. So there, there is curiosity among the average person about the past, but they are not satisfied with the academic explanation. And I feel that it is because of how it is presented. Like if we present it in a great storytelling fashion while maintaining the academic rigor, people will like that, because you can see that popular history channels who maintain the rigor, they are booming. And Graham Hancock is also doing well. He has, like, I think it's his second season on Netflix.
At
I
least
saw
that
the
much,
first
yeah.
one. Yeah, I saw the first one. In fact, I must say that I didn't know about Gigantica before he pointed it out. And after that, I looked up the actual academic work done on Gigantica. So that's one good thing he does. Like, he gets people interested in these historical sites, which, let's face it, the average person wouldn't have known otherwise. So had it not been on Netflix, the average person isn't going to go and look for Karahan Tepe or Gigantica. That's my experience. So he brings people to the table, but then he completely like overwhelms them with a false narrative, which really doesn't hold up.
Yeah, I would agree there, because I've talked with other people who are writers or readers of history on my podcast before about this subject, where I think that there is something interesting there with Graham Hancock specifically, like the idea that human civilization is older than we think it is, at least to me, on its face seems plausible. Not to the degree that it's like, oh, that there's this pre-ice age civilization, the Atlanteans, blah blah blah. But I mean,
Yeah,
as you obviously know, like something like the Indus Valley civilization, we only found evidence of that relatively recently. We only found evidence of the city of Troy, knowing that that wasn't mythological relatively recently. So there's part of me to think like, okay, that's possible, or like something like Göbekli Tepe, where it was, for the audience who doesn't know, this ancient site going back like 10,000 years, much later than we thought human civilization was, that had for its time advanced buildings and carvings, and it was purposely buried for some reason that we don't know. To me, that is a much more interesting story, the mystery of that, than it was aliens or ancient Atlantean civilizations or whatever, whatever it is that he said.
yeah, that's absolutely true. And part of the reason why these findings like Gobekli Tepe tend to shock us or surprise us, I think surprise would be a better word, is because in the back of our mind, we have this image that hunter gatherers are people roaming around half naked, eating like just um, living hand to mouth sustenance on a daily basis. Hunter gatherers were much more complex than we credit them for. I mean, if you take Japan, for example, Jomon pottery came first long before farming. So, civilization, our idea of civilization actually is quite Near East centric, or I think in the modern terminology, they use Eurocentric, because what had happened was the earliest excavations had started in the lands that were associated with the Bible. And because they were associated with the Bible, most of the archaeologists focused on the Near East. So they said that, okay, the cradle of civilization is here. It has to be Mesopotamia or Egypt. And even when the Indus Valley was discovered, they said that no, this can't be a different civilization, but has to be a backwaters of the Mesopotamian civilization. But later, as we came across more and more evidence, it becomes clearer to us that civilization developed in different parts of the world at different uh, stages. Like if you see the Americas, you um, don't have a lot of usage of draft animals. And yet you have this city called Cahokia. I think you might remember I had covered
Mm-hmm.
it, which was built long before European arrival. Likewise, you have pyramids in Peru, which were contemporary to Egypt, and some pyramids even older than Egypt's. So then again in Peru, I believe they would have used llamas as animals. But again, a lot of the technology that we see in Egypt or Mesopotamia was missing, and yet you have these fantastic structures. So the idea we had about human civilization, or still most people have about human civilization, that first there were hunter gatherers, then there was farming, and then there was pottery, and then there was cities, and then from cities we had civilizations growing. This idea is actually not supported by archaeological evidence, but I feel that the communication to the average public hasn't been good. That yes, hunter gatherers were sophisticated. They could settle down, live in a place. They could grow crops long before farming. Like if you have this archaeological site called Ohalo 2 in present day Israel, which is about 25,000 years old. And there you had sickles and other stuff that that you normally use for cultivation, and people were harvesting wild crops, and this was like at least 13, 14,000 years before farming. So the idea that we have about civilization being a linear thing isn't actually true, or something that archaeologists believe, but they haven't been able to communicate it that well to the public.
Yeah, what I would imagine that's why somebody like Graham Hancock, as you said, is able to kind of fill those gaps.
Yeah,
Because
he fills the
obviously,
void.
yeah, well, and also, like as you said, it's not always linear. It will happen in different places at different times. Steps can be skipped. You can fall back down the civilizational ladder, so to speak. And in preparation for our conversation, like it was a day or two ago, I read that I had no idea about that. There was a written language that was invented somewhere in the Balkans, like that was
Yep.
predating Mesopotamia, which to me was just such a fascinating thing. And also, that nothing of it, and you could maybe speak to this better, maybe, but to my understanding, based on what you're saying, nothing of it survived. It's basically this whole complete written language that was somewhere in the Balkans that died out. And this was before the whole Indo-European migration into Europe. So it's a very fascinating topic that, it's not as linear as historians will make it seem as it is.
Absolutely. I think I covered it uh, earlier this month in my post, Did an Ancient Balkan Culture Invent Writing Before Mesopotamia? So I talked about the Vinca culture, which I termed as Europe's first civilization. So there I'm sort of taking a little bit of liberty because many will not agree whether this was a civilization or not. But there's enough academic evidence to suggest it was. So this professor called Shanwin, he was at the University of Southern Mississippi. He had published his thesis saying pre-writing in Southeastern Europe, the sign system of Vinca culture. So when he was interviewed, he said that to me, it was quite clear that there was a script that existed in Vinca culture. And just for context, the Vinca culture flourished in the Balkans, so present day Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia. Most of the sites were found in Serbia, Croatia, and it little bit it extended also to the borders of Romania between 5400 and 4500 BC. So, as you said, this was before the arrival of Indo-Europeans. So these guys actually may have invented writing, and the purpose for invention might be associated with religion. So if we see Mesopotamia, the earliest writing was completely associated with inventory and record keeping. So the reason why they thought that, hey, we need a writing system is because we need to keep a track of the grains, animals, how many vats of beer are being produced, this kind of stuff. But in Vinca, they found all the writing shards um, in objects that would normally be associated with religious symbolism. So, what was the purpose for inventing writing? We do not know. But there is good evidence that this could be writing. Some people call it proto writing, others are saying no, it is writing. But there is sufficient there's no academic consensus whether what they call as the Danube script of Vinca symbols as writing. But it is possible that they did invent writing quite some time before Mesopotamia. And this is a controversial claim, but that a claim that is backed with academic evidence, and it is not like a claim that an Ice Age civilization existed.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the important distinction to make there. But to kind of backtrack a little bit, since this is something that I wanted to talk to you about, and this is related to the original point. Um, Another thing that you write about that I find really interesting is food history. Because I
Yeah.
don't know if you know, Anthony Bourdain was a food writer and travel writer, and he said something to the effect of like the best way to get to know another culture or get to know another person from another culture is to get them talking about their food. And you wrote a really interesting piece about like Indo-Chinese food. And funny enough, last night that inspired me to order. I got some Chinese takeout since my wife was out of town. I ordered Singapore noodles, which I don't know if it's something you have in India. But it's like an American Chinese dish that's like a stir-fried rice noodles with curry
Yep.
powder and stuff like that. So it's something that really made me think about something that I find really interesting and I'm passionate about is food history, and everything from like how in the United States, the Cajun slash Creole food, because my dad's side of the family is from that part of the country, so I grew up eating a dish like gumbo, which is a combination of like French cooking, Spanish cooking, African, and Native American to become its own unique thing that is, for me, one of my favorite foods. But it's something that's so interesting, and you can learn so much about, kind of like you were talking about when you're looking at this, this ancient Scandinavian inside their stomach. You can learn so much about their culture, much in the same way when you look at different dishes, like the spices or the techniques that they use or the ingredients. It will tell you so much about the culture that created it.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad to hear that you are also a fan of Anthony Bourdain, because I still binge watch some of his shows.
He's great.
Yeah, the Kitchen Confidential never leaves my side. I mean, the humor, the man was incredible. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the void he left in the food world. I mean, these days you have so many food blogs on YouTube. Probably that Sunny guy from the Best Ever Food Review Show sort of like fills the void 10%. But in my opinion, Anthony Bourdain was like um, what they call in sports a generational talent.
Yeah,
So
once in a generation for sure.
yeah, he was once in a generation. I mean, the way he presented food, keeping the cultural sensitivities and everything, and despite that, he had that sharp sense of humor. It was truly amazing. And I'm so glad you like Singapore noodles, because Singapore noodles, I have seen it in India, I have seen it in US, I have seen it in Canada. So I'm guessing it's a pretty popular dish.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, yeah. They add a little bit of curry powder to it, uh, and sometimes they don't. It depends. Like in when I had it in Philly, I saw a little curry powder added to it. So that could be considered an Indo-Chinese dish, or maybe can, because Singapore has the influence of both Indian and Chinese. So that can be considered an Indo-Chinese dish. But I typically think when people talk about Indo-Chinese cuisine, they talk about the cuisine that originated in India, like the cuisine that Chinese immigrants brought to India, along with some of the border foods that we developed. Like if you remember, I mentioned about momos.
Yeah,
Momo is
another one of my
something.
favorites.
Yeah, Americans just know it as wontons or dumplings. I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. The ingredients vary a little bit. So that is the Tibetan and Nepalese dish, which is extremely popular throughout India, and you get different versions of it in all of Southeast Asia, Far East, everywhere. So regarding food history, yes, that is one thing I have recently added to Forgotten Footprints, because as I told you, my approach to history isn't conventional. I just don't look at traditional records and come up with something. I think that the best way to present history is to talk about different parts of the past that continue to affect us, and one of them is food. And
Mm-hmm.
if you noticed from my latest post, I also talked about how the chicken spread across the world along with rice. And so that is the history of animals, is also something I try to cover a little bit. But coming back to food history, um, you mentioned about Cajun cuisine and gumbo, and that is a great fusion cuisine that we can think of. Likewise, in India, one of the dishes that I grew up quite fascinated with, and it has a lot of regional variations, is the biryani. So the biryani is essentially a rice and meat dish that is found in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. And it is one of those dishes that possibly existed in a different version in India before the Silk Road trade. And after the Silk Road trade, you have a completely different version. So, what we call biryani today is you have meat, usually chicken or lamb or mutton, as it is called in India. Uh, this is cooked with layers of rice, and then aromatics are added, and then you seal it and slow cook it for a long time. So this dish uh, probably existed in a very different form where the rice and meat was cooked together, which is what was called pulao in the ancient world. And then the word biryani actually comes from the Persian word birinj, which means fried. So the rice, when it gets cooked in that slow, we that sealed vessel, we call it dum. So the way it gets cooked, it sort of creates like a crispy rice flavor, like where each grain is quite
Mm.
distinct. So this is one of the dishes that has quite fascinated me since childhood, because I observed that every region I go in India, they have a completely different version. And then in Pakistan and Bangladesh, they also have different versions of this dish. Uh, the most interesting part was in my region or Bengal, we add potatoes to this dish. And potato was not a traditional Indian ingredient, and it also didn't come through the Silk Road trade. It came through the Portuguese. So the Nawab, the last Nawab of a state called Oudh, which is in present day Uttar Pradesh in India, uh, the city is called Lucknow. So the last Nawab of Oudh, when he came to Bengal, he had a lot of European guests because that time British were there, the Portuguese were there, French were there, and Europeans loved to eat roasted meat and potatoes because they just got it from the New World, and potato was like a expensive dish back then. And potato was slowly introduced to India. Initially, today potato is a very cheap dish, cheap vegetable, but back then it wasn't. So to wow the guests, the Nawab said that okay, let us come up with an Indian version of meat and potato the way Europeans liked it. So what his chefs did was they put the meat and potato together in the biryani along with the rice to create this amazing aromatic carb and meat combination, which wowed everyone. And since then, potato became a staple of the uh, biryani in Calcutta. Uh, and you won't find that in any other place in India. And in fact, most places they make it quite differently. There are quite a few different styles. So this is one dish which has always fascinated me because it sort of reflects the history of the Silk Road and how India was connected with the Silk Road trade, as well as how like different groups of people who moved into India, whether by conquest or migration, affected the region's cuisine. So this is one dish I wanted to discuss, and the other one which you might be familiar with. Are you familiar with schnitzel? I'm guessing yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So typically, schnitzel, the way you get it in US or Europe, it will be made of veal or pork or chicken. These are the three versions I have seen. But when Europeans came to India, they wanted to have this dish. The, these three ingredients were not that popular. The Muslims don't eat pork, Hindus don't eat veal, and chicken was still not that popular among people as it was today. So what the chefs did was made it with fish. So you slice the fish thinly the way you have it in schnitzel, and you added some ginger garlic paste, a little bit of green chili depending on the palate, or sometimes no green chili, pepper, salt, and it was prepared the same way schnitzel is prepared. And this dish came to be known as fish fry. It simply is called fish fry. But fish fry in Calcutta or Bengal is made in this style. In rest of the country, it is not. So this is a quite an interesting dish that I learned that okay, it came from schnitzel because the process of preparation is exactly the same as schnitzel, and it was made for European guests, but it sort of became popular for everybody.
And and I'd say first of all, you're really making me hungry because biryani is maybe one of my favorite Indian dishes. But there, I don't know if you have you there's a YouTube channel called Tasting History with Max Miller. Have
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's
I've seen
great.
it.
He recently did an episode on biryani, and I thought was really great. And just as a side note, it kind of makes me think of so my little sister actually studied abroad for a year in Russia, and she brought back a number of Russian recipes, and one of them she brought back was plov, which is in a lot of ways very similar to biryani because it's
Yeah,
like a meat and rice and
clove is
vegetables.
from Uzbekistan actually.
Interesting. But even still, and maybe you could tell me, and this is just me speculating. We don't have to go off on a tangent. I
Yeah,
wonder because Russia has that shared Asian influence through the Mongols. I wonder if the Mongols and the Silk Road um, and all that travel and trade influenced plov. So, but all that to say, like I think if it's one of my favorite interesting I guess trains of thought and discussions to have the way that food travels and it could tell you so much about culture, everything from you have like a dish like chicken tikka masala, which was based in India but adapted to the British palate, or the
yeah,
United States equivalent being General Tao's chicken, which is not a dish that exists in China, but much in the same way that um, chicken tikka masala would take Indian spices but adapt it to the British palate. That's kind of what General Tao's chicken did for Chinese cooking for the American palate. And it's something I always find so interesting because I grew up in the Midwest, the American Midwest, and we have a lot of Hmong people, like Hmong immigrants, and trying their food, and they would put like what we would have like pork sausage, like pork American breakfast sausage, which has like the American seasonings and palate, and they'll put that in their cooking. And to me, like that's what's so interesting about history and culture, and seeing the ways that everything mixes organically, and people will, even like be it like people from India or China moving to the West, or vice versa, will take whatever the local ingredients are and adapt it to their palate. And that's kind of a microcosm about what I find so interesting about history is how adaptive humans are in that context.
that is true. I mean, first let me get to the clove, and then I'll come to this east-west cross connection.
Yes,
So,
please.
clove is a dish that exists almost everywhere in Asia. In India, we call it pulao. In Uzbekistan, they call it plov. In Afghanistan, also it is called pulao, and Iran, I think it is called pilaf, and Turkey also it is called pilaf. So you have this dish, but it's prepared very differently in different parts of the world. The Russian version is closer to how they do it in Uzbekistan. So what they do in Uzbekistan is they heat lard from Dumba. So if you might want to look up fat-tailed sheep, so they have interesting posterior which is used
Mhm.
to generate the oil, and in that either beef or lamb is fried, and following that they add carrots, a little bit of cumin, and different types of raisins, and after that they add the rice, and then they cover it with these round vessels and let it steam. So finally, I think the garnish they add horse meat sausage. I think horse meat is a taboo in US. It's not so much in Uzbekistan.
Mhm.
So they add that and quail eggs and things like that, and then they serve you. Of course, these are customized. Not everybody eats horse in Uzbekistan as well. So these are customized, and then they serve you. The Russian version is adapted from this one. Uh, Personally, one of the best pulao versions I have had is the Kabuli pulao, what they make in Kabul. What they do is they just fry the onions with cumin and then add carrots, meat, and rice. It is quite similar to the Uzbek version, but a lot more onions are caramelized. So it gives an amazing flavor. So that is one of my favorite versions of this dish. And it is quite possible that the recipe that your sister bought was inspired from the Soviet Union, because still a lot of Russians live in Uzbekistan and Uzbeks in Russia, vice versa. So there was a cultural exchange in this corridor. And Mongols, we'll get to Mongols a bit later, because they influenced Russia and Europe in many ways that we don't think or don't credit them for. We'll get to that a bit later. The second point that you raised was about the East-West cultural exchange, like how people adapt to the ingredients that are available locally. Because I remember going through the menu of Chef Vikram Vij. He's one of the entrepreneurs and well-known chefs in Canada. He was also on Dragon's Den, which is the Canadian equivalent of Shark Tank. So I was seeing one of his recipes. He had either short ribs or pork ribs on the menu, but prepared in an Indian style. And I thought that there is no Indian restaurant that will serve you that. So he
Hmm.
clearly adapted it based on the local ingredients. So he always had this motto that Canadian ingredients, but Indian food. And likewise, US companies, when they come to India, for example, McDonald's, when they came, they started introducing many flavors like chicken tikka burger and aloo McTikki. These burgers were like focused more on the domestic market. They did not, of course, in India, by and large, big companies will not sell a traditional beef hamburger, because there are restrictions from state
Hmm.
to state on cattle slaughter. So some places they do, other most places you won't find it. So the traditional American burger won't be found in India, but you'd find McDonald's selling a ton of different burgers which are adapted to the Indian palate. And they are a lot more spicier than what you'd get in the United States.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what it was, but there was one particular, like it was an Indian street food. It was a like a potato, like a fried potato patty that had like some chutney on it or something. All that to say, that looked delicious, and I wish they would sell that in the U.S., but that's neither here nor there. Um, but that kind of touches on something else I wanted to discuss with you. A little while back, I posted on Substack asking for recommendations on books for somebody who's not too particularly familiar with Indian history, where they would start. And I have it ordered, and it's whichever one you suggested. It's ordered and it's on its way. But if you want to repeat that and tell the audience, if somebody were like me and I said, kind of to my shame, my understanding of Indian history is usually where it intersects with other cultures, like say Persia or the Greeks or England or something like that. So I wanted to kind of remedy that and have a better understanding of Indian history. So what books would you recommend, and like what would you recommend to somebody from outside of India, like to understand, like even conceptual, like what would you say about that?
Absolutely. So I'll give you both the academic, non-academic
Hmm.
books, and I'll also give you a little bit background about Indian history writing and why that is important. So, uh, Indian history writing, and as you know, India still has the Asia's oldest museum. Indian history and archaeology research is actually quite old. It is the oldest in Asia. But after independence, there was a clear directive by the government to change the way history is written. So a there was a push for a Marxist nationalist rewriting of history. So they said that okay, any research done during the colonial era was to serve the British imperial project, and we have to undo that. We have to come up with a different narrative. So a lot of history that I have seen that we grew up reading had a strong Marxist bent of mind, and now that is slowly shifting to postmodernism, but it is not as postmodernist as, let's say, Western academia. It's still heavily Marxist dominated. Um, I usually tend to um, not like a strong ideological stance. And having read the Marxist historiography, as well as the works that were done during the British imperial era or by the researchers just after India became independence, I still think that they are far more neutral and fact based, objective based. And as you know, what happens is in India, there are different communities living, and sometimes they clash over historical icons, events, and figures. The modern history writing was to make sure these sensitivities are taken into account. The colonial history writing was to present the facts. So I would suggest, if somebody wants to start off with Indian history, they should start off with actually R.C. Majumdar for ancient India and Sir Jadunath Sarkar for medieval India. And the thing is, I am not that familiar with medieval India because I'm not, honestly speaking, I'm not that interested in medieval India. Ancient India is really good, and R.C. Majumdar specialized in researching on India's contact with Southeast Asia, but he was very well versed with ancient India. A more modern writing would be Upinder Singh. She has done a great job in taking into account the past research, the Marxist school of thought, the nationalist school of thought, which eras were romanticized by each of them. She has sort of distilled this information quite well. So her book on ancient India, though it is primarily dependent on secondary sources and not primary sources, it's a great book for any beginner.
Hmm.
So I'll tell you the exact name of the book. It is his a history of ancient and early medieval India from the Stone Age to the 12th century by Upender Singh. So this is one book that is published by Pearson. I would recommend this for everyone. And of course, R.C. Majumdar's Ancient India is another book, Advanced History of Ancient India. That is another book everybody should have. These are the two academic books. Now, if you're looking for non-academic books, John Key's India is a great book. Charles Allen's Ashoka is a great book on ancient India's most well-known emperor, Ashoka. Charles Allen has written a number of great books. His recent books, The Aryans, is another great read. This is for anyone who's interested in Indo-European history and how it affected the politics of Europe, India, Iran, and different countries, the racism associated with it, and what is true. He has done a good job summarizing all these things in his book. It was published posthumously. I would recommend you go for it. Charles Allen's Aryans. And John Key's India is good. Charles Allen's Ashoka is good. And I would say those who want to start off with Indian history, they can begin here. And then you can select the areas of history which you like and then specialize or look up more research heavy books based on that.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate that. I think that that might have been the one that I bought it. There's a website called Thrift Books that has like you can buy used books and they're on an average like $5 to $10 each, and it's kind of become my weakness. But it's interesting that you say that, and if you don't want to get it too much into this for time, I understand. And forgive me, I'm trying to be sensitive to the historical context here, but it seems like particularly with Indian history, it's something that can be a little bit difficult, especially for an outsider to dig into, because of the what you mentioned with the context of colonial history and modern Indian nationalism. My understanding that something like the Indo-European migration is something, at least for a while, that was fairly controversial because it was used to justify colonialism. But I think my understanding is like most modern historians don't um, necessarily see that way, because I mentioned the Indo-European migration into Europe as well as India and the Near East, but it was used to justify colonialism, so it becomes a difficult topic to talk about.
Yeah, so that is one of my favorite topics actually when it comes to ancient India, because that is one topic. If you see my subscriber chats, and you know James quite well, and he also
Mm-hmm.
pitched it. Um, Recent research has opened a can of worms. That people nowadays, there is a strong lobby of people who don't believe that Aryans migrated to India, but they were indigenous to India. And there is another group which believes that, okay, Aryans did migrate to India, but they came so long ago that by the time the Vedas were written, there was like no contact with the steppes or wherever they came from. There is another route that is suggested these days by Paul Haggerty, who's a linguist at Max Planck Institute, that Aryans may have come from the southern route. So they basically went across Iraq, Iran, and across the Zagros Mountains and into the Indian subcontinent. So basically, that was the same route taken by the first hunter-gatherers from Zagros Mountains. So he suggests that that could be a route for dispersal of Indo-European languages rather than from the steppes. Evidence, we have evidence for uh, both the steppe migrations as well as the migrations from the Near East. In India, that is a sensitive topic. That is a sensitive topic. Many people still believe that, and I'll tell you why it is a sensitive topic. For example, if you see Greek culture, people don't tend to see it as an exclusive Indo-European culture, right? They see it as a Greek culture. But when anything comes about with India, like let's say discussion on Sanskrit, or there is always a subtle push that it was Indo-European. Though pretty much everything was developed in India. Even if it was by Indo-Europeans, it was developed in India. So let's say if we take an American dish, like you mentioned about Cajun, right? We don't see Cajun as French or Spanish cooking, even if it had those elements. We see it as an American, Southern American dish. Likewise, we see barbecue as a Southern American dish. But there is a resistance among, I'm not saying all, but some Western scholars as seeing Sanskrit and Vedic culture as inherently Indian, even if it was by the Indo-European people. Like they settled in India and they absorbed a ton of the local elements. And the culture you had was the Vedic culture. The archaeological, genetic, every evidence points to this, that at any point of time, you had a strong step influence. You had many elements from the steps, like the horse and other things come into India, but you have a ton of local Indian influence mentioned in the Vedas, which is always put in the backseat. Like you have stuff like parrots mentioned in the Vedas. There is no parrots in the steppe. People point out that in India there were no horses, correct, but there were no parrots in the steppes. So it is not a culture that originated in the steppes. It is the culture that had elements from the steppes or elements from Iran, and it originated on the banks of the seven rivers. So this is what many Western scholars have not been sensitive about, which has led to a furious nationalistic response in India. Uh, my opinion is yes, there were elements of steps in the Vedic culture, but it was something that totally arose on the banks of the seven rivers that are mentioned in the, or the river system that are mentioned in the Vedas, that stretches from present day Afghanistan to eastern India. So this topic, in my opinion, will continue to evoke strong responses, even if people are from a scientific bent of mind, because there are people in India who are trying to falsify that, oh, there was no influence from the steppes and everything was indigenous. And they sometimes go overboard trying to point out amulets with spoke wheels that were found in Indus Valley as evidence of spoke wheel chariots, even though we see the first spoke wheel chariots in the steppes in the Shintashta culture, which I had covered sometime last October. Here, I think the Indian historians, or rather who are trying to present a strong argument in favor of India, could have used a more rational approach, saying that, look, the Egyptians imported the chariots, the Chinese imported the chariots, and they became like a part of their society. That doesn't mean they were Aryans or Indo-Europeans. And why couldn't Indians have imported the chariots and horses? Because they continued doing so for centuries after that. So here's some of the tricks that Indian historians miss when they put up a very nationalist defense in favor of indigenous Aryans, rather than looking at the evidence and studying other contemporary cultures. Like chariots became a part of Chinese society like by the 1200s. So it is quite possible that the Indo-Europeans who had settled in India continued importing chariots from the steppes and continued importing horses from the steppes and made it a part of the Indian society. It doesn't have to be that you have hordes of people from the steppe driving chariots and horses coming into India and ruling the people. So these are some of the tricks that people miss. This is a sensitive topic, but it is there is more debate from both sides I have seen, which are based on emotions rather than based on facts. And that is the unfortunate part about this debate, which sort of prevents further research and prevents us from presenting or listening to views from different sections of the society. Like I know linguists present a different story, sometimes archaeologists present a different story, geneticists present a different story. These days, they have like sort of come to the forefront, and people are too focused on genetics, ignoring the archaeological evidence. So we are in interesting times when it comes to Indo-European research, but you're right, because of colonialism, the response you get from India or the pushback you get from India is always going to be way worse than, let's say, Greece or Europe or Britain, where Indo-European invasions are acknowledged, but they are not considered like completely erasing the local cultures. In some places they did, in other places they did not. Like, for example, in Greece, we see that the Dorian invasion theory, which used to be promoted once upon a time, has become quite weak. And we see in many islands, such as Crete, where you had the Minoans, even after the collapse, the Mycenaeans sort of continued their culture. So in India, that appreciation is lacking, that the Aryans could have continued the previous cultures, because they clearly did. They clearly did. Many of the Aryan rituals, such as Soma, where you drink this hallucinogenic potion, was present in pre-Indo-European cultures, both in India and in Central Asia.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic, and it's one of those things where, like, I understand why it's a very sensitive thing, because I would say, first of all, on one level, like, even in the West, it's become like, if you say the word Aryan, it's radioactive because of the Nazis and the 20th century
Yes.
Germans, and but also at the same time, like. To loop back to the beginning of our conversation, to me, what is so fascinating about history is, like we were talking about with the food, there's migration, there's mixing of cultures, like there's a shared heritage and a recreation of shared myth, but that can get very messy as history goes on and there's more context. But I guess I have one more question for you because I want to be respectful of your time. And this is just kind of a fun, more interesting one. So if you have is there any like historical figures or time periods or anything in history that you feel are like particularly overlooked that like, if somebody like me or maybe some people in my audience were casual fans of history, what would you suggest for them to look into?
So, historical figures and events. Okay, so some of the things I think you already know, which I've covered. Like, I love these nameless figures who have never been mentioned in any history books, like the Tolan Man. I don't know if you're familiar with the Siberian Ice Maiden, which I had covered.
Hmm.
I love these kind of figures as well. But among the figures that we know and were actually mentioned in historical documents, but are grossly ignored, for me, the favorite would be Modu Shanyu, who, or Modun, as the Chinese call him. And probably in his language, he was known as Bagatur, which sort of his name has become synonymous with bravery, because in Persian, Russian, Hungarian, you have various versions of his name, which just means brave. Like in I think Turkish they call it Bahadir, in Persian Bahadur, and then again in Hindi it is Bahadur. His name was Bahadur, which just has become brave. So this guy was the founder of the Xiongnu Empire. The Xiongnu were the ancestors of the Huns. Xiongnu actually translates to who knew, from which we get the word Huns. And the Western audience is familiar with Huns, but they're not that familiar with the Xiongnu, who were the arch nemesis of the Han Chinese. So this guy, Bagatur, is one of my favorite characters because every time I read about him, it reminds me of Chengiz Khan from maybe uh, a different millennia. Like, he was born sometime in the 3rd century BC. And back then, the Xiongnu had been like, they existed. They were just called by different names by the Chinese, like Rongdi, and who basically it meant barbarian in Chinese language. So these guys were the reasons why the Chinese would start building walls to keep them out. And their power had greatly reduced before this guy called Toman, who probably was his father or uncle. I'll explain why uncle later. He conquered what we know as the Inner Mongolia region in present day China and started sort of pushing a little bit towards the Chinese. And these guys were hemmed in by two tribes. One was the Yuezhi and the other was Donghu. So the Donghu were the ancestors of the present day Mongols, and the Yuezhi were the ancestors of Kushans. So these guys took Modu as the USG took Modu as a hostage, and Toman attacked them, hoping that they would kill him. But he comes back. He sees the horse, comes back to his father's court, and his father is impressed with his bravery, promotes him to a general. But he finds out that okay, his life is at risk, and there is this amazing story in which he starts training people to obey him unconditionally. So first, what he does is he takes his favorite horse and he shoots at it. His soldiers are instructed that you have to shoot at the horse. Those who didn't do, they were simply executed. Then he does that, I think, with his wife, or probably I can't recollect the story that well, but he does that with his wife or an important woman. And again, they shoot. It probably wasn't his wife. He did that with the horse. And like, there were several targets like that till the soldiers realized that if you don't follow him, you'll be executed. And then one day he goes on a hunt with his father, and then he shoots the arrow in the direction of his father, and all his soldiers fire at him and they kill him. And he takes over the throne. And when he takes over the throne, the neighboring tribe Donghu shows up, and they ask him for his father, for his best horse. He gives it to them. His ministers protest, and he executes them. for not obeying him. Then they come and ask him for his wife, and he gives his wife away as well. And the ministers are shocked because that had never happened in the history of the steppes. And he executes those who disobey as well. And finally, they come and ask for a small piece of land. And this time the ministers keep quiet. And Modu goes in a rage that why didn't they stop him from giving the land? And he executes those who advised him to give the land away. And he said that a woman and horse can be traded, but land is non-negotiable. It is the basis of a nation. So this guy was the first step empire builder in history. And I know some scholars like Chris Beckwith talk about the Scythian Empire, but we don't know where the command structure existed and who were its leaders. But here we know of a confirmed steppe empire, which was actually the largest empire in the ancient world. It was twice the size of Alexander's empire. And this is grossly ignored by history, in my opinion, that there was a guy who could build an empire and a legacy much long, which had a much bigger impact than Alexander's, because his ancestors, his descendants would continue playing a key role in world politics as the Huns. And one scholar, Hyunjin Kim, he's a classicist, I think, based out of Australia. He has argued that Europe actually got the feudal system from the Huns. And the Huns traced the feudal system to the Xiongnu, who had this amazing command structure about who will rule which area and how the power should be divided. So, and this Xiongnu Empire lasted much longer than, I would say, Alexander's empire, and its effects were felt till the Middle Ages. So this is one of the most underrated empires and historical figures, which I think we can put a little bit more emphasis on. I know John Mann wrote a book on it called Barbarians at the Wall or something like that. I will just tell you what John Mann's book was called. Let me just look it up. That was a good book. I think if you're since I introduced this topic and some of your followers would be interested, it's called The Empire of Horses, the First Nomadic Civilization and the Making of China. This is something I think your followers should read so that they know about Xiongnu and Modu. This is one of the important historical events, important historical figures. And another very interesting historical figure I came across, which is not discussed much in Indian history, and I was surprised that an American historical channel called the History Dose covered it, was this guy called Yashodharman who defeated the Huns uh, sometime around the mid 5th century. He was a ruler from central India, from an obscure dynasty called the Olikaras, and they actually left very good records. But for some reason, Indian historians were not interested in this dynasty. I found a lot of work done by French archaeologists and linguists on this dynasty. Uh, the Huns were one of the branches of the Huns. They are called the White Huns. They were quite strong in Asia. Like the Attila's Huns attacked Europe, the White Huns attacked India and Persia. And a sub branch of them called the Alchon Huns, they attacked India and almost took over the entire North Indian territory. And then you have this guy Yashodharman. He rallies all the local Indian rulers and puts up a fierce resistance against the Huns. The way he fought them, it completely broke their back, and after that, there was no Hun rule left in India. So, in my opinion, this was a very key turning point in Indian history. Otherwise, the outcome could have been quite different. And the funny thing was, the Huns who attacked India actually converted to Hinduism. They were Hindus, which most people don't realize. that they were devout followers of Shiva, and they saw themselves much like Attila, who saw himself as the heir to the Roman throne and the restorer of Rome. The Huns who attacked India saw themselves as the legitimate heir of the Gupta imperial dynasty, which ruled before that. And they said that, look, we are here to restore the rule. And it was quite interesting that I found that a Hindu army invading India, it probably has never happened in Indian history. So this is one of the underrated events from Indian history which fascinates me.
Well, that is a fascinating story. I'm glad I was able to have you on to talk about that one because that is just completely new to me. So, Prateek, we're coming near the end of our time here. Do you have any plugs or promotions or anything you have coming up in the near future that you'd like to promote?
Okay, yeah, a few things I want to say before we get to the promotion. One of the things about the ignored aspects of history
Uh
that
huh.
I wanted to discuss that probably you are more familiar with: gunpowder, passport visas, and paper currency. These were popularized by the Mongols and introduced to Europe. But typically, we see Mongols as a very destructive force who destroyed cities and didn't contribute much to civilization. But it's quite interesting that we still continue to use many of the things they introduced in Europe, like the gunpowder technology. Gunpowder wasn't invented by them, but it was introduced to Europe by them. And paper currency was a project of Kublai Khan, who believed that the different weights in currency between Persia, China, and different Mongol lands was creating a huge problem. So he introduced paper currency, never took off, but the idea was visionary for the time. And the third one is the concept of paisa, a sort of passport where the Khan would give you a declaration. And if you had the declaration, you could sort of travel. You can call it a passport or you can call it a visa. It's basically a paper document, or sometimes it was a tablet, metallic tablet that the person who's carrying, some guy like Marco Polo who travels throughout the empire, he would just show it and he would get the hospitality anywhere. Because back then, how would you know that some guy is a spy or somebody else? The only way you could was by showing some kind of identification or trade good that would say that, okay, no, you don't pose any threat. So these are some of the impacts on the world history which I think has been ignored. But I think Jack Weatherford's book, Genghis Khan and Making of the Modern World, though I don't agree with much of the research done on that, popularized some of these narratives. So it is not that the Western audience or the global audience are unfamiliar with, but many of the good things that the Mongols did are still quite underrated.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it and recontextualizing the Mongols that I feel like maybe a lot of people, especially in the Western world, aren't familiar with. But if that sounds good, that's maybe a good note to if you want to give any plugs and promotions.
Yeah, in terms of promotions, I would like your audience to know that I will be releasing a book soon. It is called Forgotten Footprints. It is the same name as my newsletter, where I cover stories from the lesser known chapters of history. It should be coming out before end of the year. So if your followers can keep an eye out, that'll be great. And of course, you're all welcome to come to Forgotten Footprints, check out what I have to offer, subscribe. There's a ton of free content, and of course, for paid subscribers, also I provide a lot of content. Come check out the newsletter, and yeah, that's about it.
Perfect. Well, I will be anxiously awaiting that book because I can't wait to read that. And I can attest to, as a paid subscriber of Prateek, it's all worth it, though. So check it out. So I just have one quick last question I always like to ask all my guests, just to end. A brief one is, the world is a little bit crazy right now, but
Yeah.
what's just a little bit of an understatement? But what's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future?
This is a very interesting question, because if you are more into current affairs, you feel like the world is a very depressing place. Every single day there is like a war breaking out, and this is not like an ancient war with catapults and fires. We have nuclear technology now, so it is easy to feel quite pessimistic. But always remember, there is a ton of great discoveries about the past that we are making. Whether you're interested in history, archaeology, even paleontology, there's a ton of great discoveries that are coming up every single day. And that sort of makes me hopeful that there are still a lot of stories about the past that we don't know. And maybe uh, only a few years ago we have learned about it. For example, the lost cities of Amazon. I talk about it in my book as
Hmm.
well. Um for a long time, we thought this was like a Graham Hancock type hoax, but indeed, there were cities in the Amazon. So this is something that should make you feel hopeful. And of course, I would say, take care of yourselves, take care of your mental and physical health, prioritize yourself. It is very easy to get caught up with politics, celebrity gossip. These kind of things consume us, drain us. I would say, take a step back, prioritize yourself, explore other avenues, explore history, explore archaeology. And if you don't like history and archaeology, there are other things that can lift you up. Explore those things. Try to go out of your comfort zone. Try to learn something new. If you don't like history or archaeology, I always recommend people to learn a different language, learn about food of different cultures. If you are into food, learn about food from a culture you're unfamiliar with. And you will realize that people are not that different from culture. Governments don't define us. Our nations don't always define us. I think I remember a very good quote that you post that you made few days back, saying that you are indifferent about being an American. Could you just elaborate it a bit so that I'll further give your viewers my comments on that?
Yeah, well, I don't remember exactly what I said, but yeah, no, I feel there's a lot of negativity from both sides of the American political spectrum right now about America, its history, its future, etc. And I feel kind of indifferent, just because this is where I live, this is where I work, this is my friends and family are. America as a concept, I neither hate it or love it. It's just where I live.
Yeah, I understand that. But as someone who grew up in a developing country and lived and worked in America, I can tell you that Americans have a lot to be thankful. Many things which are luxury in other world is just a given. Like, you have 24 hours running hot water in America. That's not the case everywhere in the world.
Hmm.
You have constant, like, most places don't face a power outage unless there is like a huge snowstorm or a hurricane. These things are blessings. The country has so much open space. There are many things that are not right with the country. The food systems have gotten corrupted. People's mental health are often affected by the lack of work life balance. But there's a lot of good things about America. So, likewise, what makes me feel hopeful is if people could just see their surroundings and think that, okay, there is a lot of negativity in the world. Tomorrow I can wake up and see these Democrats and Republicans fighting, making my life miserable. But what is good about my life? What are the things that I have that, let's say, someone in a war-torn region doesn't have? What are the luxuries that I have? Like, For example, I can tell you right now that if you are in America, you have a much wider range of access to knowledge than anyone else in the world. Like, I know there are a number of books that are banned, but still you have so many libraries, so many book options. You have an amazing access to knowledge. Tap into that. Tap into the positives that you have about your country. Tap into the positives that have, and I'm not saying this just about America. Even in India, there are many luxuries that people in India, many good things people in India have that Americans don't. For example, our food systems have not yet got so much corrupted the way the American food systems have. We still have far less chemicals added to our food. They are getting corrupted, but they still haven't reached the levels that US has. So, paying a normal price, we still get good food. That is very difficult in America unless you go for these whole foods or premium organic foods. So there are good and bad in every nation. Unless you are living in a war-torn region, I would say try to see the positives that surround your life, and try to connect with a different culture, different food habit, or try to learn a different language that will broaden your horizons. And that is what makes me hopeful about the future.
Well, Prateek, that is a very beautiful sentiment, and I appreciate it. And with that, I'd like to thank you so much for coming on, and you're welcome any other time you'd like to come on. So thanks for having this discussion.
Absolutely, I enjoyed this, PJ, and I hope we can do this again in the future.
Absolutely, I'd like to. All right, you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.